Good evening. I'm Dana Morgenroth. I'm the president currently of the Pittsburgh Freethought community, and you're all here to hear an exciting lecture by Farris Naff, who's come in from Lincoln, Nebraska, just to speak to our little group. So we're honored to have him here. I want to tell you a bit about PFC. Some people find us on Meetup, and when they come to an event like this, they'll say, "Oh, I'm glad to come to this Meetup." And it always jars my ear because the Pittsburgh Freethought community is a lot more than just a meetup group. Of course, we advertise on Meetup. We have a presence on Facebook, all the social media. We're actually a 501c3 nonprofit charity, if you will, and we try to do a little bit of good in the world. So we're more than just a group of folks that meet up here and there. Tell you about our mission, if you're not familiar with us. In summary, we try to promote science, reason, and humanist values in the greater Pittsburgh area. And that takes the form of doing three things. We try to be a welcoming and caring community for all those who share our humanistic worldview and an evidence-based perspective. We try to provide a strong public voice for the secular humanist community, a community that's often underrepresented, often called the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, the people that check off the box none, as in no other religious affiliation. And again, we're trying to promote science and reason and critical thinking as opposed to dogmatically imposed beliefs that can't be questioned and we think often lead to the wrong conclusions and the wrong prescriptions for the problems that occupy society right now. So we have a website, pittsburghfreethoughtcommunity.com. Please visit it. You can find our events. We have social events. We have lectures. We have activist events. All kind of different things that we do. We have political actions that we take. We invite you to participate in any of those that might interest you. Join our community, sign up on our mailing list. It's completely free. If you like what we do or you choose to become more involved with our group, we hope you'll consider becoming a member. Right now, our membership fee, I like to express it in terms of Starbucks. It's about half a dozen Starbucks, $20 to join the Pittsburgh Freethought community. You get the neat little enameled pin, you get a name badge, we'll honor you and treasure you forever. So hopefully visit our website, learn more about us. Introducing Mr. Naff tonight is Andy Norman, who's a director of the Pittsburgh Freethought community. Andy is our resident philosopher, if you will, and we're honored to have Andy's wife Heidi with us tonight, and also Andy's parents. See if you can recognize who they are in the future by the resemblance. Andy is the director of the Humanist initiative at Carnegie Mellon University, very important part and relationship that we have with the initiative there to promote humanist values. And he's got a new book coming out, and I demand and require that before Andy introduces Clay, he tells us about his book. Andy Norman.
Thanks, Dana. This feels very odd talking into this non-amplifying mic. I am going to take a pass on the book description, but keep your eyes open. You'll hear about it sooner or later. I'm actually very pleased to introduce my good friend Clay Farris Naff, who we met at a American Humanist Association conference 4 or 5 years ago, about. It was in Colorado. Clay is a science writer and former Tokyo bureau correspondent for
United Press International.
United Press International. He's the science and religion correspondent for the Humanist magazine, and he's a very good amateur philosopher.
Yeah. Oh, thank you very much. I'm going to dispense with that altogether. I want to take a moment to thank Andy and Heidi for inviting me and putting me up in their home. Hopefully they won't find everything that I've broken until after I'm out of town. And I want to thank the Pittsburgh Freethought community for inviting me here to speak to you. This is actually my first trip to Pittsburgh. Even though I did most of my growing up on the other side of the state in Philadelphia, I never made it out here until the day before yesterday. So I'm really pleased to be with you. I'm also grateful that they've erected a shield here in case you don't like what I have to say and you start throwing stuff. I can just duck out of the way. But hopefully you won't find it that repulsive. So I'm here to talk to you on the theme, can humanism overcome human nature? And we have to start with some tough realities. People do terrible things. They rob, they assault, they kill strangers, apparently for no reason at all. They make war on unarmed neighbors. And as those of you living here know, they sometimes enter houses of worship and slaughter people at prayer. By all accounts, such things are getting worse, both here in the U.S. and abroad. Why? What causes such horrors? And what, if anything, can be done about them? Those are some of the questions we'll explore this evening. But first, let me ask, how do those images make you feel? Uneasy? Anxious? Angry? Hang on to those feelings. They'll prove important as we go ahead. But let me try to put some of those images into context for you. It is true that ideologically motivated terror attacks are on the rise here and around the world. But terrorism is a tiny slice of violence in the world. In Europe, a European in 2014 had a 1 in 4 million chance of dying in a terrorist attack. Here in the U.S., 1 in 7 million. You are 10 times more likely to be struck by lightning than to be a victim of a terror attack. And violence itself is a tiny part of human behavior. And fortunately, globally, violence is on the decline. I have to underscore these points because even some self-declared rationalists seem to have trouble grasping them. Sam Harris, for example, seems to think that we should be at war with Islam. He's gone so far as to say, we should profile Muslims or anyone who looks like he or she could conceivably be Muslim, and we should be honest about it. Now, since anyone on earth can be a Muslim, this is a remarkably stupid statement. Yet he said it in 2012, and it's on his website even today. The bigotry in it is bad enough, but as policy, it makes about as much sense as building a wall to deflect ragtag bands of asylum seekers. Getting back to Islamist terror, there are more than 1.5 billion Muslims in the world. By the most extravagant estimate, there are no more than 100,000 involved in Islamist terror. Of those, the vast majority are in Muslim countries, particularly in the Middle East. To take the number involved in the entire Western world, because the numbers here in the U.S. are so tiny that you can't even perform a calculation. If we followed Sam Harris's advice, we could expect to find a terrorist in 1 of every 15 million inspections. But that's assuming we had a Muslim detector. This is a tragic instance of how scary images in the news can warp minds. Even the mind of a PhD scientist nominally dedicated to rationalism. How much worse is it when the President of the United States does nothing but watch and react to a scary propaganda channel? Clearly, we have our work cut out for us. So let's get real. There has never been a safer time to be alive. Those bar graphs on the top represent the rates of homicide among pre-state peoples. And as you come all the way down to the little group of bars at the bottom, those represent deaths in societies that had developed states. At the top is ancient Mexico. If you just compare ancient Mexico with everything above, you can see it's minuscule. But if you come all the way down to that little red bar at the bottom, that's the rate of violent deaths in the US and Europe today. People have never been freer or nicer to one another. And even for the poorest of the poor, life has never been so good. And yet, and yet it is all at risk. Why? The simplest answer, I believe, is that new technologies are exploiting ancient vulnerabilities in human nature. I'm talking about communications technologies, and especially the social media. All the same, consider this. I expect you're all familiar with the post hoc fallacy. Just because one event follows another doesn't mean that the preceding event caused the following event. With that in mind, consider the most influential social media entities, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, launched in the early 2000s. At that time, there was considerable overlap between Democrats and Republicans in this country, so much so that the two party names overlap. By 2014, they had drifted far apart from one another. Over in Europe, starting in about 2008, as social media began to spread there, anti-Muslim and anti-Jewish bigotry began a resurgence. In the decades since, bigotry has busted out all over, here in Europe and in other parts of the world. Today, rage is all the rage. Can this really be put down to something in our genes activated by technology? Does human nature even exist? The answer might seem obvious, but it is quite contested. Those of us who favor human nature have a surprising ally, the Bible. Christianity says, yes, human nature exists, and it's her fault. Everything was perfect until Eve gave in to temptation and persuaded Adam to follow suit. Of course, not everyone agrees. Take a women's study course, says Toni Erickson, and you will likely hear something like this. Everything we can observe, such as gender differences, are because people have constructed them. Culture rules. Men are violent, not because of hormones, but because of socialization into toxic masculinity. Ideological feminists are not the only ones who hold on to anti-human nature ideas. Much of the humanities and social fields are hostile to the idea that science has anything valid to say about human nature. Marxist scientists also deny human nature, presumably because its existence would rule out the possibility of perfecting society through revolution. And romantics, who these days we call New Agers, look back longingly to Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his noble savage, corrupted by the decadence of civilization. So who's right? Does human nature exist? If we take human nature to mean genetically programmed traits, preferences, and dispositions, is there any evidence to settle the question? Well, yes, there is. There's tons of it, in fact. Consider immigrant children. If a child arrives before the age of 12 and mixes with native speakers of English, that child will grow up speaking English like a native. Children who arrive well after the age of 12 will most likely retain the accent of their parents. Why is that? The developmental answer is that our brain's plasticity gradually disappears as we go through puberty. But the evolutionary explanation goes deeper. A child's potential mates lie among his or her peer group. To be able to communicate effectively and attractively is essential to reproductive success. So the ability of the child to instinctively mimic the language of peers has been selected as an adaptive trait. In short, it is human nature. Well, if we've settled that, let's ask, is there any evidence of humanism? I think our presence in this room is evidence enough of that. So how do human nature and humanism relate? If you were a Martian, you might naively imagine that they support one another. But sadly, that's not the case. Sure, humanism is built on various outcroppings of human nature, such as reason and compassion, but it is mostly a cultural artifact. Where humanism strives to be rational, human nature harnesses irrationality in the service of genetic interests. In other words, irrationality is often adaptive. Take narcissism, for example. The odds are more than 2 to 1 that you and I are pretty much average. Yet nearly all of us share in the self-deceptive element of human nature called narcissism. Here is a neat example. A recent survey found that 80% of Americans rate their driving skills as above average. Now, there's worse to come. Humanism upholds the ideals of equality, fairness, and justice. Yet human nature seethes with aggression, oppression, and with xenophobic hate. Is this really all the result of culture? If so, we truly have a global culture now. For every country in the world seems to be erupting in a form of xenophobic nationalism. In reality, we have to face the ugly truth. We are naturally liable to be hateful, aggressive, and prone to exploit others. We all have an instinctive fear of strangers. We all have vulnerabilities that clever, malevolent people can exploit to bring out the worst in us. Yet I'm not saying that human nature is entirely evil or corrupt. There are at least 2 reasons why that answer won't hold. First, as Santa knows, we can be divided up into naughty and nice. Second, although people range from sociopaths to saints in their personalities, most of us are at times naughty and at times nice, depending on circumstance. And finally, if human nature were entirely selfish, evil, and corrupt, we could not possibly have survived, let alone achieved the amazing feats of cooperation that we see around us. If so, how in the world did any of us get past a state of pure selfishness? The answer in a word is sociality. But how? Charles Darwin pondered these questions. Having finally published his theory of descent with modification, he went on to explore the implications for evolution for humanity. Here is what he wrote on this topic. It can hardly be disputed that the social feelings are instinctive or innate in the lower animals, and why should they not be so in man? For firstly, the social instincts lead an animal to take pleasure in the society of its fellows, to feel a certain amount of sympathy for them, and to perform various services for them. After the power of language had been acquired and the wishes of the community could be expressed, the common opinion how each member ought to act for the public good would naturally become in paramount degree, the guide to action. But it should be borne in mind that however great the weight we attribute to public opinion, our regard for the approbation and disapprobation of our fellows depends on sympathy, which forms an essential part of the social instinct. In other words, even though we're all driven by selfish genes, sociality has evolved as our greatest feature. Indeed, for us humans, it is justly called hypersociality. But if that's true, why hasn't the social instinct made us all good, decent human beings? Well, once again, Darwin, that master of reasoning imagination, came close to the answer. Here's what he wrote. It is extremely doubtful whether the offspring of the more sympathetic and benevolent parents, or of those who are most faithful to their comrades, would be reared in greater numbers than the children of selfish and treacherous parents belonging to the same tribe. He who is ready to sacrifice his life rather than betray his comrades would often leave no offspring to inherit his noble nature. The bravest men who are always willing to come to the front in war and who freely risk their lives for others would on average perish in greater numbers than other men. Therefore, it hardly seems probable that the number of men gifted with such virtues or that the standard of that excellence could be increased through natural selection. This has come to be known as the free rider problem. There's a heated debate going on right now among top-notch scholars about how best to explain it. Those are some of the people whose ideas about evolution I respect the most, but they absolutely do not agree on this question. So we won't try to settle that particular question tonight. Nevertheless, one thing is undeniable. We have so far managed to cooperate enough to construct a world-changing civilization. Now, I know that not everybody is happy about that. Some of us see humans as being the ultimate exploiters of the natural environment. Indeed, there are even some who think that the world would be better off without us. I give you the voluntary human extinction movement. But there are yet two more things that are undeniable. The first is that, as I said, people have more happiness in their lives now than at any time in human history. If for no other reasons, consider these. We suffer virtually no attacks by predators. When it happens now, it is shocking news. This poor young woman was an intern at a zoo, and as you can see, a great animal lover, and she was recently attacked and mauled to death by a lion. You may have heard about that. It made news around the world. It's such a rare event. But there's more than that. We now lose very few children to infectious disease, and almost none of us starve to death. Now, you may think I'm speaking from a place of privilege, and I am certainly aware of my good fortune. But what I'm describing here applies largely to humanity. Childhood mortality, which used to claim more than a third of children born to parents, has fallen worldwide to under 5%, and it's dropped in half over the last decade or so. There's a story in today's New York Times that documents this. Extreme poverty, the poorest of the poor, have increased their lot at a very rapid pace over the last few decades. Extreme poverty has dropped by 1/3 worldwide since 1990. More people are thriving than ever before, and more of them are living in democracies than at any time in all of human history. Now, terrible things happen to people every day, but keep in mind, there has never been a time as good as this. And it is absolutely certain that without the continued progress of human civilization, all life on Earth will die. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next century, but the future, as science reveals it, is quite clear. If nothing else, and there could certainly be other catastrophes, a few billion years from now, the sun will swell and incinerate the Earth. Only humans can understand this and conceivably do something about it, if civilization survives long enough to make that possible. That brings us to the biggest question of the evening. Can humanism overcome human nature? The past 100 years or so suggest that it can. In that time, unprecedented social progress has taken place. Let's look at just a few of the indicators. Women got the vote. Urbanization spread. A majority of humanity moved from the country to the city. Now that might not sound like a benefit, but it really is. Life, on average, is safer and better in cities. It also allows the countryside to be available for other purposes than just dwelling. Democracy spread. Legal slavery, serfdom, and racism, legal racism, all but vanished. Women's equality became a norm in much of the world, if not yet a reality. Prosperity spread and poverty shrank. War and local violence receded. And most recently, in much of the world, sexual minorities gained legal rights. But if the past century has been all about progress, the past decade suggests that human nature will have the last howl. New technologies have fostered old habits. To be precise, new communications technologies have leaped over schools, newspapers, television, and the mainstream religious institutions to get inside the heads of millions of people and exploit their human nature vulnerabilities. One in particular, I think you know, I'm talking about all of our ancestors lived, and it's how many of us live now. Thanks to their ability to cooperate, hunter-gatherer tribes proved to be the breakout species. Our ancestors thrived in settings that ranged from the tropical to the Arctic. But wherever they lived, they faced a common threat. As the political scientist John Hibbing told me, the biggest danger any tribe faced was not lack of food or shelter or protection from predators or even disease. It was the tribe over the hill. Now, there are still dovish anthropologists who argue that war is a recent invention, but I think they are hopelessly wrong. As the archaeological evidence of our violent history piles up, defenders of the noble savage pull the creationist trick of pointing to gaps. And of course, just as there will always be gaps in the fossil record, so there will be gaps in the evidence of early human aggression. But just as modern genetics demolishes creationist arguments about the fossil records, so evolutionary psychology torches the claims about an idyllic prehistory. The behavioral record is continuous, and this is what it tells us. War is as natural as sex. Our closest cousins, the chimps, engage in warfare. So do our more distant cousins, the ants. Now, some people will say, well, when animals fight, they don't fight to the death. One of them walks away. That was probably true of our ancestors as well until we became more efficient at killing. But it is not true of all animals. Sea anemones go to war against one another, and they're immobile. If two colonies grow up against each other, they go to war until one side dies and the other thrives. So which of our unconscious behaviors reveal our ancient tribal experience? Well, stitched within our genes is a powerful desire to belong to a tribe that matches up in many ways with our ancestral experience. Let's take number. Evolutionary psychologist Robin Dunbar has calculated that our ancestors lived in groups averaging about 150 closely related people. It became known as Dunbar's number. Recently, a team he led did a follow-up study with Facebook friends. Now, I'm not sure about all of you, but I can say I have more than 150 Facebook friends, and I bet many of you do as well. But this study asked probing questions to find out who could be counted as real friends, people you could share a problem with or count on for help in hard times. Turns out the number is about 150. So what were those ancestral tribes like, and do we see any evidence of them in our genetically programmed behavior today? Well, yes, we do. On playgrounds around the world, children form cliques and gangs, and in nearly every instance, these are arranged as dominance hierarchies. It's remarkable. And what are the favorite pastimes of these gangs and cliques? Well, one of them is playing war, or bullying others, putting down the nerds and the losers. Now, we may think this is just childish behavior, a sort of atavistic phase of development, like embryonic gills, but it's not. These are more than vestigial traits, like our stumpy tailbones. Dominance hierarchies are the norm in human organizations of all kinds. We work for bosses. We despise rival teams, companies, and departments, not to mention individual outsiders. Studies of implicit bias show that we're liable to fear and loathe those who look, dress, sound, or even just behave differently from us. Within the tribal mindset, we may feel loyalty and moral obligation to those in our tribe, but we can rob, rape, and kill outsiders with impunity. If you don't believe me, read the Bible, or the Quran, or the Hindu scriptures. It's all there. And if that's not enough, try this little thought experiment. Imagine you're an ancient human living in a hunter-gatherer tribe, and you're out hunting or gathering when you encounter a stranger. What do? You might run away, but then they will get whatever you are trying to gather or hunt for, and you may go hungry. You might hold out the hand of friendship, but then they might seize it and rape or rob you, or even murder you. That's what happened to Otzi, the Iceman, who lay in a high mountain pass for 5,000 years until he was discovered, and then they found he'd been murdered on his last day of life. If you're bigger or stronger or have the advantage of numbers or surprise, you can be the one to attack the stranger that you meet. Now, ask yourself this: who is more likely to have left descendants, the aggressor or the pacifist? If we want to know who we are, that's the question that counts most. Yet, in spite of all this, we have managed to overcome many of the ugly tribal instincts stitched within us. How did we do that? We built civilization. We made compacts and treaties. We passed laws. We nurtured empathy via plays and paintings and novels and other works of art. We built nations. We created institutions of justice. And in general, we widened the circle of trust such that you can fly from here to, say, Minneapolis and go to the Mall of America with a well-justified expectation of complete safety in the company of strangers. Or you can go to Tokyo with that same expectation, or even Dubai. This is truly an amazing change from our ancient past. But if these are the best of times, why are things going wrong now? Well, there are various reasons perhaps, but as I said earlier, the most salient cause is the advent of social media. We've all heard the stories of the role it played in the 2016 election, but the threat began long before that and continues to evolve today. Islamist terror became a worldwide phenomenon in the 1990s using this simple technology. Cassette tapes with recordings of fiery sermons were passed around from hand to hand to village and proved very effective in recruitment. But when the internet came along, offering free distribution of full-color video with audio, everyone got into the act. ISIS, of course, but also the alt-right, and then neo-Nazis, and Russians, and plenty of other bit players. Next thing you know, we have a Buddhist genocide underway. Who could have imagined that? Yet violent autocracy has emerged as the people's choice in places as different as Russia, the Philippines, Hungary, and Brazil. Racism, anti-Semitism, and the oppression of women had lost legitimacy, but suddenly they're rising from the grave, cloaked in an ugly, religiously tinged nationalism, all because of Facebook and its ilk. But hold on. Remember that post hoc fallacy? Do we actually have any evidence that the new media are to blame? Well, yes, we do. For one thing, there's what's known as the Fox News effect. The rise of 24-hour cable news created the opportunity for 24-hour cable propaganda. And Roger Ailes was just the guy to fill the niche. However, in fairness, we should call this the Fox MSNBC effect, because according to a study by Ali Yurukoglu and George Martin of Stanford, the impact of watching just an hour a week of either Fox News or MSNBC is the same. It skews either viewer about 7% to the right or to the left of where they were. Cable news is bad enough, of course, but the explosion of social media has greatly amplified the negative effects. And again, we have the evidence. Hate crimes against Muslims in America closely track Donald Trump's anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim tweets. A county-by-county study published in the journal Science shows that no other causal explanation holds. To those Democrats who blamed their 2016 election loss on a failure to address blue-collar jobs, I can only say, it's not the economy anymore, stupid. And this is not just an American thing. Germany has dedicated a huge effort to overcoming its Nazi past. Yet fascist violence is resurfacing there. It's directed mostly toward the hundreds of thousands of migrants that a compassionate Chancellor Angela Merkel allowed to resettle there. Many towns in Germany at first welcomed them. Then, in various places, ugly, violent attacks broke out. Why? Again, Facebook. Careful study shows a direct correlation between the viewing of hateful Facebook posts in Germany and the eruption of violence there against migrants. But again, we have to ask, why is that? After all, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube are all just ways of sharing content, right? And isn't the most bandwidth taken up by cute kitten posts and provocative selfies? Well, it turns out that social media are highly efficient corridors for ideological infection. Media critic Carlos Raza notes that people are naturally drawn to inflammatory and sensational news, regardless of whether they're true. So bad actors, conspiracy theorists, trolls, and fake news writers have been tremendously successful in using social media platforms to spread false and divisive content that exploits people's tribal instincts. MRI studies show that such posts actually switch off the reasoning components of our brains and go straight to the amygdala, where two things happen. One, they activate that tribe over the hill paranoia. Two, they activate neo-tribalism, that sense that you and your friends are being attacked by an outside group with malign intent. So by God, you better stick together. And what easier way of showing your loyalty to the group than by clicking like when the president puts out a tweet, especially when thousands of bots ensure that it's a popular thing to do. Now, I'm going to embarrass him, but this guy, philosopher Andrew Norman, has spent a decade studying how that happens. And he says it's become clear that in the last 10 years or so, systems of belief can derange people. Now, full disclosure, Andy and I have worked on several articles together, and we just published one recently. But I find what he argues to be quite compelling. If we're the smartest creatures on the planet, you might think that we would be able to spot and evade this sort of ideological infection if it's coming through screens that we've chosen to look at. But increasingly, scientists recognize that our intelligence evolved not so much to solve equations or do philosophy, but to equip us for the social challenges that are critical to our reproductive success. A failure to read the will of the leader, or to predict the next move of your rival, or even of your spouse, can lead to terrible consequences. Compared with the ability to engage in mind reading or to gain popularity, reasoning scientifically has always been an almost trivial skill. And that, I submit, is why these clods are celebrities, and this prosperity gospel shill is rich, while I'll bet no one in the room can name these three people. Anybody? Now, I'll admit to you, I only know the first one. That's Frances Arnold, and with her, I know by checking, are Gregory Winter and George Smith. They're the 2018 winners of the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. They are brilliant scientists who are virtually unknown, even though they've won a Nobel Prize. If that doesn't demonstrate that the social utility of our communication abilities vastly outweighs the intellectual power that we can apply to tasks like science, then I don't know what would. To paraphrase the evolutionary biologist and anthropologist David Sloan Wilson, the social utility of believing something crazy often outweighs the practical utility of believing something true. So, what can humanism do about this terrible truth of human nature? Now, Steven Pinker offers a great set of answers in his most recent book, Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress, and I warmly recommend it to you all. And Andy Norman has some specific answers that he is elaborating in a book that he's working on. What I'm going to tell you next is my borrowings from both of these thinkers, and any shortcomings in them, I promise you, are all mine. I think I'm pretty sure it's true. I think to address the problems of ideological contagion, we have to start, each of us individually, by questioning inflammatory posts that come before us before our emotions catch fire. We have to instill a habit of source questioning and fact-checking. Here are a few suggestions from librarian Catherine Kelly, with whom I developed an information literacy workshop. So first, if you see a provocative story, ask yourself, is this likely to be clickbait? Is this just something that's out there to try to provoke me into clicking it and making somebody else another dime or whatever it is they earn? If you think it might be authentic, shocking news, check to see if other legitimate news sites are reporting it. You can go on to a fact-checking site like Snopes or PolitiFact to see if it's listed there. But if you still have reason to think it might be, you can dig deeper. Look at the source of the information that you think might be really shocking and worth sharing with somebody else. Is there a source provided? Do they have a website? Does their website have an About section? Does the About section list people with qualifications to speak on the subject? And ultimately, if you are convinced that something's true, then go ahead, share it, like it. But if not, practice good mental hygiene. Don't mindlessly share nonsense just because it agrees with your feelings, or you think in a moment of cold panic, oh my God, something terrible is going to happen, I better tell everybody else. That's how bad ideas spread. Social media have turbocharged these things, but actually, Daniel Dennett, another philosopher, argues that memes have survival interests that can diverge from our own. And we need to be on the lookout for parasitic memes. Now here is one that has been spreading itself for a long, long time. Now, in sharing this, I'm not condemning Christianity altogether. I'm just pointing out that this is a formula that seems to have no other purpose than to spread itself. There's no reason why believing something should make you saved. That's a nonsensical proposition. You can't believe something authentically unless you believe it. And where's the virtue in that? So it appears very likely that this meme has just been spreading itself for a couple of thousand years for its own benefit and to no one else's. But of course on the internet there are all kinds of memes going around. Many of them are parasitic. Some are silly but mostly harmless. Anybody here take part in the ice bucket challenge? What was that all about? Some of them are just a waste of time. Do you remember this color of the dresses thing? But some of them are authentically virulent. So again, practice good mental hygiene. Question everything. However, Andy Norman points out you can't stop there. If you do, whatever existing biases you have will be locked in place, and your ability to determine what is nonsense and what is not will be inevitably filtered through your own biases. And much as I'd like to believe that I'm utterly free of biases, I know I'm not, and I don't believe you are either. So the really tough part of what he calls cognitive immunotherapy is challenging your own ideology. Before I give you an example, let me just ask, is anyone here an avowed racist? No? Oh, okay, good. So that's part of our shared ideology. We all agree that racism is a bad thing. So here from HuffPost, and full disclosure, I used to blog for them, is an advice article that appeared last fall titled, "What to Do About Your Racist Uncle at Thanksgiving." It advises a self-described liberal reader, as if there were any other kind of the HuffPost, against requesting a politics-free zone at Thanksgiving. Instead, the reader is instructed to tell her grandmother that the moment your uncle unleashes offensive garbage toward your family, you are going to grab your kids and go. That's terrible advice. It's not going to make the uncle any less racist. And what is it going to teach the kids? That even kinfolk should be spurned if they violate your ideological ideals? Or that you should run away from offensive speech? Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not arguing for the tolerance of racism or bullying. But people are more than their offensive ideological stances. To see this, flip the coin. Suppose you're a pro-choice reproductive freedom advocate. Does that define the totality of your personhood? Should your anti-abortion relatives shun you? It's a good place to challenge your own ideology. Ideological purity reduces people to a single dimension, much the way that racism does. Do we reject people because they don't use the politically correct terminology of the day, or because they don't wear the flag pin of the day? If we find ourselves slipping into those habits, it's time to re-examine our ideologies and the biases that underlie them. It's time, in fact, to ask whether our ideology serves to make us members of a tribe or serves convictions that we really hold. Surely Thanksgiving loses its essence if we can't break bread with our own family members and friends. And surely a democratic nation has no meaning if those who disagree with one another cannot embrace one another as fellow citizens. Now, human nature guarantees that there will always be a range of political views, passionate disputes over policy, and resistance to change. But look back. Change happens and it becomes normal. If we make the effort to punch through our own tribal impulses and reach out to those who are different from us, we can not only become better humanists ourselves, but simply by embracing their humanity, we can hope to change them. People can recover from extremism, but in every case I know of, it takes personal encounters with the other to spark the difference. Let me share a personal example. This is Mike. We first met when we worked together on a Rotary Club project. He seemed like a nice guy. We became Facebook friends, and next thing I knew, he was lobbing artillery shells at every political post I made. Yes, Mike is ex-military, and he's quite conservative. Because I knew him in person, I resisted the urge to fight back with sarcasm, and I just replied as respectfully and factually as I could. Meantime, I got to know him a little better, and I found there's much more to Mike than his politics. He's a photographer. He's a tennis player. That, in my book, makes him a great guy. He's also a cyclist, and he has a sense of humor. The more that we spent time together, the less politics seemed to matter. Mike continued to take shots at my posts online, but not in an aggressive way. And then recently, Mike did something extraordinary. He decided to volunteer with our organization so that he could teach Iraqi refugees. He absolutely loves it. And recently, after a tennis game, he told me, "You know, I've changed my mind about gay marriage." He now accepts it. For my part, I recently apologized to him for taking a cheap shot at the Catholic Church in one of my posts. I haven't changed my mind about that institution, but I recognize that if I'm going to criticize it, I should do so head-on and in depth. Now, the skeptics among you are going to say that one anecdote does not count as evidence, and you're quite right. Maybe Mike was looking for a way out of his conservative lockbox. Maybe I'm an extraordinarily persuasive guy. So, to close, here's one more. Christian Picciolini was just 14 when he got sucked into white nationalism. He went on to become a violent neo-Nazi. That's him on his left with his girlfriend at the time. He's since profoundly changed. And what turned him around? Living in Chicago, he couldn't help encountering blacks, Jews, gays, all the people he nominally hated. And this is what he says. "It was these folks who showed me empathy when I least deserved it. And they were the ones I least deserved it from. I started to recognize that I had more in common with them than the people I surrounded myself with." So here's my take-home message from Christian Picciolini and me. Humanism can overcome human nature. All we need is the courage to meet hate with love and be kind to one another. We have done it before, and we can do it again. Thank you. Thank you very much.